Well, welcome everyone to League of Women Voters Dane County Virtual Nano Forum on Preserving the Wetlands That Protect Us, Revenge of the Marshes. This is the fourth in our climate crisis series offered by League of Women Voters Dane County. We have had forums on role of local government in climate crisis, the links between climate change and public health, a forum on the promise of ag stewardship in relationship to climate change. And we had a forum planned for April that would have been in person, but we were not able to hold it. Instead, we are holding this virtual nano forum to share with everyone. And we think that it's super relevant right now with an upcoming vote in Madison City Council on stormwater ordinance. So we have special guest, Professor Ken Potter. Dr. Potter is an emeritus professor of civil and environmental engineering at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He came to University of Wisconsin with a PhD in geography and environmental engineering at Johns Hopkins University. His teaching and research interests are in hydrology and water resources, and they include estimation of hydrologic risk, especially flood risk, stormwater modeling, management and design, adaptation of hydrologic design to climate change, sediment and phosphorus control through management of streams, drainage ditches, and wetlands. He's been a member of numerous National Research Council committees, including Committee on Restoration of the Everglades Ecosystem, Committee on New Orleans Regional Hurricane Protection Projects, and the Committee on Levees and National Flood Insurance Program. He's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and an American Association for the Advancement of Science Lifetime National Associate of the and a Lifetime National Associate of the National Academies. So we're very pleased to have Professor Potter here to talk to us, and please take it away.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's really a great privilege to be able to talk to this group. I'm so sad I couldn't do it in person, and I'm hoping that those of you that see this will get in touch with me by email or whatever to talk about any issues, because that's often the most important part of this talk. Next slide. Okay, just a quick review of what you need to know about hydrology, and it's really pretty straightforward. Hydrology is not that complicated. Liquid water moves downwards, either into the ground or down the slope. If water moves more slowly than it's supplied, it floods. That's what floods are about. Downward moving water can be impeded by an impervious surface, which is concrete, parking lots, compacted soil, or the water table. And of course, in urbanized areas, we have lots of impervious surfaces. Or it can be impeded on a channel or pipe that can't fully convey it. And that's the problem with the Yahara Lakes. The Yahara River can't fully convey it. The limiting factor of channel or pipe flow depends primarily on the size, slope, and internal roughness. Next slide. All right, it's pretty clear that flooding in Wisconsin is increasing, and it's a combination of climate change, which is producing increases in the magnitude, the size, and the frequency of heavy rainfalls. But land development is also a big factor, and it's those impervious surfaces that are the problem. We really need to do a better job of ensuring that new development doesn't continue to increase flood risk. And we have to do some retrofitting, because most of the development in this county was developed before regulations got into place. Next slide. I'm also going to talk a little bit about soil enhancement and the appropriate use of vegetation. They're underused strategies, and they really could be used more effectively here. And the other thing that I want to mention towards the end is that we have to be careful that when we fix a problem in one place, we're not increasing the problem someplace else, because the water's got to go somewhere. And that's something we sometimes overlook. Next slide. Okay, I'm just going to quickly review the typical kinds of flooding. So we have lake flooding. That's probably the biggest issue in Dane County. Many lakes drain slowly, and that's the issue. And so flooding results from the amount of runoff rather than the rate. This is really important. Rate of runoff, that's the velocity at which the water moves. But when the lakes are draining slowly, it doesn't matter whether the water came in 15 minutes or in a day, because the lakes can't move, the channel can't move that water. So that's critical. So it's the increase in the amount of water that matters, not the rate. And then there's stream flooding. It's due to both the amount and the peak runoff rate. Next slide. And then we can have local flooding in developed areas. So this is the smallest scale. And this generally occurs when we have extreme events that exceed the capacity of the storm sewer system or whatever the drainage system is. And then there's an emerging problem in Dane County, and it's actually not brand new. When I first came here years ago, there was flooding in the northern part of the county, and there still is. There's groundwater flooding where groundwater has risen to the surface. But now we're seeing it all over the county, including in Madison. And that's really problematic because one of the big treatments we use, practices we use, is to infiltrate water, and we don't want to infiltrate more water in a place where the groundwater is rising. Next slide. Okay, so lake flooding. That's probably from a point of view of law damages, that's probably the biggest issue in Dane County. Here are two significant plots. Fortunately, we've been collecting data on Lake Mendota and Lake Monona and the lower lakes too for many, many years. And what you see at the top are the annual maximum levels of Lake Mendota. And then at the bottom, the annual maximum levels of Lake Monona. And they're on the same vertical scale. And the interesting thing is, number one, Mendota has really increased in recent years. So 93, big flood in the Mississippi River, you probably remember 2000, 2008, and then just 2 years ago. So big events have been occurring recently. For Monona, the first half of the record, the maximum annual level was decreasing. And the reason for that is that the lake managers at the time held back water in Lake Mendota in order to protect Lake Monona, because we have more houses vulnerable to flooding in Lake Monona. A lot of you realize that. A lot of the houses in Lake Mendota are elevated above the lake and not so much in Lake Monona. But that changed when a new manager came in. Actually, I think it was Ken Kosick who started to balance it more, so we weren't sacrificing Mendota to help Monona as much. Next slide. Okay, land use change. That's my big concern. Climate change is important. It's something we have to keep in mind, and it's going to make things a whole lot worse. But what we can't have a really quick change in that. That's a train that's already moving. But we can do something about urbanization, and urbanization significantly increases the amount of runoff, which matters to the lake, and then the rate of runoff. And so that increases the risk of lake flooding and stream flooding. And as I said before, the main factors are impervious surfaces, compacted soil. We often compact soil when we develop, and then expedited drainage. Storm sewers move the water a lot faster than they moved before. Next slide. Okay, so this shows us where we are in terms of development. I don't have the most recent development figures, but I have numbers from 2017 and then 1970. So 1970 is the blue. That's the development in the Yahara watershed in 1970, and then the red is what's occurred since then. So both of them together show you what we had in 2017, and of course that's increased up, pretty much increasing along the corridors up in the north. There's been a lot of increasing there. And so the take home there is, look, only a small part of that watershed has been developed. Look at the Mendota watershed. Most of that area today, as well as back in 2017, is not developed. It's in agriculture. And so we can do a lot of damage if we don't develop properly. Next slide. Okay, one thing that's fascinated me ever since I moved to Madison are these internally drained areas. Internally drained areas are areas that where the water, pretty much the surface water, stays in the watershed. And that resulted from the fact that the ice that was over there, as it receded, it blocked a lot of the smaller channels and created what we have today, many, many ponds. And the ones I'm most familiar with, Stricker Pond, Tiedemann Pond, Graber Pond, in the Middleton area. And they're very sensitive to runoff. And when I first came here, it dawned on me right away that if we develop, as we develop those, we're going to increase the water levels. And then what do we do when we start to flood the houses around? Well, we then connect those previously undrained areas into the drainage system. So that water now flows into the streams and into the lakes. So we basically enlarge the drainage area. And you can see there's a significant area in the closed depressions, many of which are still closed. And so we've got to be careful that we don't develop those and then deal with the flooding by letting it go. Now in Dane County, over the last couple of decades, we've done a pretty good job that when we extend the urban service area, we've required that they not increase the volume of runoff. So we've done a pretty good job in Dane County, but we got to keep our eye on this. Next slide. Okay, well, what happens when we drain a closed watershed? We have a great example on the west side. Back around 2000, a little before 2000, Madison developed a closed watershed in the South Fork of Pheasant Branch. Okay, they developed a watershed in the South Fork of Pheasant Branch in a closed watershed. And that water that didn't escape now escapes into the stream, into Pheasant Branch. And so what I've put together here is I've gotten the flow data on Pheasant Branch Creek, and I'm comparing it to Black Earth Creek, but I'm only comparing the storm flow portion of the stream flow. Okay, Black Earth Creek is, a lot of you are familiar with it. It has very high base flow. Base flow is water coming out of the ground, and it's cold, and that's why the fishery is so good there. And so for both of these data sets, I subtracted the water that was base flow and only looked at the storm flow. That's the flow that came directly from the storm event. And you can see the big jump in the ratio of the Pheasant Branch, South Fork of Pheasant Branch around 2000. And that's because of the closure, the opening of that watershed, the development and then opening of that watershed. Next slide. Okay, so we now control volume to some extent, and I'll explain in a few minutes so we don't fully control it, but we had runoff volume controls in Wisconsin in 2002. Wisconsin DNR passed these requirements. And what most people don't realize is that these requirements were passed on from the federal government as a result of the Clean Water Act. And the sole purpose of the runoff volume control was to prevent stream erosion, which occurs when you control the peak, but you don't control the volume, because you basically have a lot more water flowing through the stream at relatively high flow. So even if you control the highest flow, if you don't control the volume, the increase in volume, you're going to get stream erosion. So those runoff volume control requirements are strictly for channel protection. They have nothing to do with flooding. There was no intent to deal with flooding. Next slide. Okay, so we do have an ordinance that came out of this, and that's that requires the control of 90% of the water that didn't run off before development. That is, there can be you can have a 10% decrease in the water that does not run off. Okay, and we call that stay on. So the total rainfall either runs off or stays on, and stay on is evaporation and then infiltration to groundwater or groundwater recharge. And so we only control 90%. We still increase that volume of water by 10% of what stayed on before. And because pre-development stay on is typically large, again, it's a 10% decrease results in about a doubling of runoff in a normal year. So that 10% matters, okay? It matters because the runoff is only a small percentage under natural conditions. And so that's really critical. Next slide. Now, I had the pleasure of chairing a great Dane County committee that had lots of really good expertise. We met for over a year. We had consultants and we had engineers from the cities and towns. So it was a really nice committee, and that committee unanimously recommended 100% control. 100% control of pre-development stay on. And then within a month or so, the legislature prohibited any local government from increasing the stay on requirement above the DNR limit. And that didn't recognize the fact that that requirement was only intended to address stream erosion, not flooding. There was no awareness of this, and there was no real public discussion. It was just passed in the bill. So right now, nobody in Dane County, nobody anywhere in the state can go above the 90% requirement. Next slide. So what does that mean? So I had a grad student, Nick Hayden, who's a consultant now in town, and he modeled did a computer model of a hypothetical development, looking at different levels of control: 100%, 90%, 75%, 60%. And on the left, you see the pre-development runoff. Okay, on the if you go to the 90%, that's the present rule. The 90% allows a 55% increase in runoff for this hypothetical development. Even the 100% results in an increase, and that's because the 100% DNR rule is based on one particular year, and that wasn't a very wet year. So when you look at a wet year, you get a significant increase even at 100%. Next slide. So how do we control volume? And I think a lot of you are familiar with these strategies. We largely infiltrate, so we have to have mechanisms for doing that. On the top left, you see a bioretention area in the street. Bottom left, anybody recognize that? That is the roof of the City Hall in Chicago. And that's a fantastic practice there, okay? And of course, they're really challenged in Chicago. There's not a lot of space to do this kind of stuff. Up in the top middle, you see permeable hardscape that works really well. You can do things in parking lots, so you can have porous asphalt. That's the bottom of the middle, and that works well. And the porous asphalt and porous concrete can actually increase 100 inches per hour. It's amazing. I mean, that's more than any soil. It's amazingly effective, and you do have to maintain them over time, but they're very effective. Top right, you see a tree facility there that allows some infiltration, and then you get the evapotranspiration, which is good. And then in the bottom right, that's a bioretention cell in a parking lot. Next slide. Now, there's another strategy that can be used. I mentioned that when we compact land, when we can develop land, we typically compact it. We have all that heavy equipment. It compacts the soil. In fact, a typical strategy is to strip the topsoil and then do some of the construction and put it back on. And depending on the value of the home determines how good a soil they put on to some extent. But anyway, inevitably you get compaction. And it turns out that compaction can be fixed by something called subsoiling. And subsoiling is a combination of tilling, a deep till, so it's one blade that gets dragged along the ground. Chisel plowing is another kind of plow that farmers use, and then adding compost in the process. And you don't have to do that everywhere. Some recent research by a colleague of mine in civil and environmental engineering showed that if you just do the flow paths, you can get all the success you need. And what I mean by the flow paths, I mean the path that water takes when it goes from a downspout to the street. So that's a small percentage of a total lot. So if you subsoil that, you can be very effective. Next slide. Okay, back when Jeremy Belusik was a grad student, so this was about 10 years ago, he did a really nice study of subsoiling. And what he did, he had a number of plots that were identical. He rained on them with a sprinkler. He rained the same amount. And this is showing a result of a test of 2.2 inches in 30 minutes. And he had a control, so that was compacted, heavily compacted. And then he did deep till. He heavily compacted all of the plots and then left one of them as a control, and then he did deep tilling plus chisel plowing, and then deep tilling plus chisel plowing plus compost. And you can see it reduced when you combination of all of them reduced the runoff to practically zero. Now, back when he did that, there was an effort to try to do some of this in Dane County, but it never was very effective. But I had some grad student buddies who were in Maryland, and I sent them this information, and they've gone gangbusters in Maryland. So they require this all over the place. Next slide. And here's a demonstration that I got in touch with my old buddies, and they sent me some of these pictures. This is doing some deep tilling and some subsoiling in Maryland. Next slide. Okay, now the criticism that we got after the committee published the recommendation that we have 100% control, the criticism was we're going to increase the cost of construction, and it means a lot of people were going to build further away. They're out of the county, so or it was going to make it hard for people to buy homes. And we recommended strongly that we use runoff volume trading, and pollution trading is an old practice. It's been done for a long time, and trading means that you basically get the people who can do it most efficiently to do it, and they're compensated by people who aren't efficient. And so we recommended runoff volume trading, and that meant that if you couldn't meet the entire requirement, you could pay a fee, and the fee would be based on what the cost would be in the most efficient situations. Next slide. This is trading goes back, has a long history and a significant history in Wisconsin. It's analogous to other pollution trading systems. So the first one I remember is acid deposition. A lot of you are old enough to remember when we had really bad air quality, but not maybe so much in Madison, but in many parts of the United States. I know I was, when I was in grad school for a short time out west, it was terrible. You could barely walk in the afternoons, much less exercise. So what was done there is, and here we were dealing with sulfur and nitrogen oxides, they allowed power plants who were super efficient to compensate for those that were less so, and then they were compensated for what they did. We've been doing this for biological oxygen demand. Okay, when we put organic waste into a stream, that waste degrades, uses up oxygen, and that kills whatever's in that stream. And so we've been doing that since I came here. That was about when that started. And the Wisconsin and Fox Rivers, paper mills in particular, were putting a lot of organic matter into the stream, and they do trading there, and it's been magnificent. Worked great. And then now we're using phosphorus trading to deal with the phosphorus problem we have in Dane County that's affecting our lakes. Next slide. Now, one thing that's critical to recognize is that, as I mentioned before, if you fix a runoff problem in one place, you're liable to increase it someplace else. And so there are all these interactions. High lake levels, for example, cause flooding because they raise water levels in the adjacent groundwater. And they also can back up water in storm sewers. A lot of the fixes of the problems that occurred 2 years ago are involving sending water downstream. Tiedemann Pond, for example, in Middleton has just increased its pumping rate from there so that they can draw that down more quickly after a big event. And everybody went along with it. Madison went along with it, but it is going to create some downstream problems. And so we do this. It's hard to avoid it, actually. If you fix it, you pretty much have to pass the water on somewhere. Now, one way to get around that is to use infiltration practices, but infiltration practices can cause groundwater flooding, and we're starting to see groundwater flooding in Dane County and in other parts of the state. And then it's important to realize that doing infiltration on a piece of land right near the lakes isn't going to do you any good at all, because that infiltrated water will flow into the lakes. Next slide. Okay, the groundwater flooding. That's becoming a real problem, and it occurs in low areas or areas that have some sediment layer that's impervious, and therefore water that infiltrates gets held up. It's really common in internally drained areas, but can occur in other places. Next slide. Now, the big challenge of this kind of flooding is you don't know what's happening until it happens. Okay, you can't anticipate it. You know, if you're next to a lake and every year it's getting higher and higher, you can say, "Wow, we got to fix this." But with groundwater flooding, it could just all of a sudden, in a wet year, you have it, and then it could. In fact, if you remember 2 years ago when we had that flooding, groundwater was high then, and we had there were places. Spring Green had water in one development in particular. There was groundwater that was a foot above the surface. Now the irony there was that it occurred in the development, and the developer lived in that development. So there was a little justice there. So anyway, we need a program to identify where groundwater flooding is going to occur in the future. Otherwise, because we don't want to be infiltrating there, and we need to be prepared for what will happen due to climate change, which is obviously independent of the development issue. Next slide. So one thing and this is just something I've got to in the last year or so, is we've really got to focus more on vegetation, because remember, 2/3 of the annual precipitation evaporates or transpires if we have the plants to make that happen. Okay, and so we've got to figure a way to green up as much as we can. Next slide. One example. So whenever we have high water tables, we're going to need to do this. And one thing that's I'm on the Middleton Water Resources Commission and have been ever since I came here. And we're going to look at Esser Pond, for example, which by the way was completely dry when I came here 30 years ago. It only get wet in a storm. Now it's a permanent pool of water, and I'm thinking we need to draw that down because it connects to the South Fork of Pheasant Branch, and use that to store water and to evaporate water. So we're looking at that. So we need tall, deep-rooted plants, and willows and cottonwoods are used around the world to do this. They're not necessarily people's favorite trees, but they can handle wet conditions, and they do promote evapotranspiration. Next slide. Okay, so let me just summarize. Flood risk is increasing. There's absolutely no doubt. Climate and land use change are the big issues. Climate change, we're going to be slower to fix that one, but we can fix the land use change thing. That's something we can do immediately. But our current practices are insufficient, and some of what we do makes things worse. So we've got to be more careful about that. So we really got to look at this from the watershed scale, and you know, the watershed approach. We got to think about the whole system. Next slide. Okay, so recommendations. We've got to repeal that legislative limit on volume control. Okay, we've never really mounted a good effort to repeal it. I've probably given a dozen talks since then, hoping that eventually we could get enough political will. But we've got to fix that. But you know, we need to have trading to go with it, and the county's actually moved ahead already with the trading system. So you know that won't be hard to get in place. Another thing that I haven't talked about is the statistics we use to design in Wisconsin, and this is true everywhere in the world, are based on historical data, and they don't represent the increases in rainfall. So we need to change those standards. Madison's having this hearing coming up. They're going to change, rather than changing the rainfall, they're just going to require 200-year control rather than 100-year control. But in any case, we have to deal with it. I prefer us to use what we think the rainfall is going to be in the future, because we have people that have done really good research on this. Dan Wright, a colleague of mine in civil and environmental engineering, has come up with some really good estimates of what the future rainfall is going to be. Next slide. Well, we have groundwater flooding as a potential problem. Vegetation, we need to look at making better use of that. We need to coordinate better across jurisdictions. I think we do a pretty good job of that. And then, as I said before, we've got to be looking at watersheds. Okay, so I'm ready to take questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Ken. I know we have some questions for you. These are coming from members of the Climate Crisis Forum Committee. First we have a question from Mary Plazer.
Okay, hi Ken. I am wondering, since I live in a 96-year-old house, and we've been sort of very slowly upgrading it, I've been wondering what I can do that would give me the biggest bang for my buck if I wanted to prevent stormwater runoff. I want your opinion because a green roof sounds overwhelming to me, and permeable driveway sounds pretty good, but I want to know what would be most helpful.
Well, that's a really good question, and I just walked around the last couple of days in my house, which I haven't been in all that long, and I'm trying to figure out things to do, and it's not easy, okay, because you're retrofitting something, so it's always challenging. I think we really ought to have some kind of program where we get people to help homeowners figure this out, because I'm struggling to figure it out, and I know what I'm doing pretty much, but most people are just not going to be that familiar. So I mean, but just generally, what you can do is figure out where the water's coming from, rooftop, driveway, and where are there places to capture that water. And the challenge, for example, of the driveway is a lot of times they're designed to go right down the street. And, you can pull out that concrete and put something permeable in, but can the subsoil handle it? Is it really worth it to do that? Because there's a cost effectiveness here. We don't want people doing things that are super inefficient, because that'll give a bad name, for one thing, if it turns out people are having to spend a lot of money. So there really has to be assessment of individual homes, and I'm wondering whether we couldn't have a program where we trained a number of people, because it isn't that complicated to figure this out, and then we made them available to homeowners like you to look at your property and come up with solutions. But in general, deep tilling would be good on flow paths. So anytime you have I know in the last house I was in, I had two main downspouts from the house. One was in the backyard, and I put 2 rain barrels in there and left them open all the time, but flooded the backyard with it. And so I don't think that water ever got to the front yard, to the street, because the rain barrel slowed down the rate of flow to the point where it could infiltrate days after. And then on the front, I extended the downspout so that it paralleled the road, the house basically. So, and then had it flow out on the whole lawn. So now I was at least using the whole lawn. I'm not capturing all of it, but capturing most of it. So, but every case is different, and so that's why I think we need to develop some expertise and then share that with other people.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ken. Thanks, Mary. Let me remind everybody to be on mute if you're not asking a question right now, and also to enable your camera when you do ask a question. Next is Pat Patterson.
Yes, my question goes sort of tags on to Mary's. I live in a almost 100-year-old house like Mary, and at the bottom, close to the bottom of the hill that drains into Lake Mendota. And we're interested in doing something, but we obviously need help doing it. And how do I find professionals who can take a look at this and not just say, well, we got to direct the water away from your house? So what kinds of things do I need to look for as I'm talking to people to look at the drainage issues?
Well, again, it's almost the same answer. We need to develop a group of people with expert, who pick up the expertise and who are available to help. And we've done that kind of thing in the past in Madison. So I think that's it isn't the kind of thing where you can come up with just general recommendations, because all these things are specific. And so if you really have to, somebody's got to look at your property, and it may turn out that, it's just not really feasible to do what sort of the standard practice would be. And I think it wouldn't be hard to train a bunch of people to do this. And I know something like this was tried 5 or 6 years ago, because I had a student that got involved a little bit with it. But I think we need to probably revisit that. There are a lot of people that have good understanding of their property and could I think learn what's necessary to go out and help other people. So that's the only thing I can think of. There is no general solution. It's not like I can give you a handbook. You really got to go walk the property. And the most challenging thing, and I'm facing it with my house, is what are the soils there once you get 6 inches below the ground? What are the subsoils? Because I have clay where I am, and I don't know how deep that clay is. I don't. So I'm not sure how well a practice would work. Understanding, and the other thing, in an urban area, the things in the soil survey and so on are not necessarily useful, because the changes due to urbanization have been large. So that's about the best I can answer on that.
All right, thank you, Pat and Ken. Next person with a question is Georgiana Hernandez.
Hi, Ken. My question really gets to the art of persuasion, and I'm wondering what you think might be the most effective way to try to convince builders and developers that it's actually in their best interest to move toward using green infrastructure practices.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And by the way, in Middleton, we've run into several builders that take pride in this. They do more than we ask, okay, and they come up with creative solutions. And one thing we could do is maybe reward that more and advertise it more. I think we have to have more citizens understanding this problem and be supportive of this, so that there's more awareness and therefore the developers would recognize that there's a group of people, a large number of people out here that really want this. So I think that's important. I'm wondering whether we could have some kind of certification. We have leads for buildings. I don't think that those requirements go very much into this drainage kind of issue. So that's probably a major thing we could do is to have some kind of certification.
All right, thank you, Georgiana and Ken. Next person with a question is Ralph Peterson. Ralph, we need to make sure you're...
I can. Question: in your talk, you said that we need to aggressively use vegetation to prevent groundwater flooding, especially in areas of high water tables. 2 questions. One, how do you anticipate that climate change will affect the water tables in Dane County over the next 1 to 5 decades? And what resources are available to help the wide variety of we's in the county, ranging from city dwellers to town and village residents to rural residents and farm owners?
Well, there's you have 2 pieces to that question. We really need to have a better understanding of what the present groundwater system is. And I've already been in contact with Ken Bradbury, who's the director of the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey, and he would be very interested. He did a groundwater, his organization with the U.S. Geological Survey did a groundwater study for the whole Dane County years ago, but it didn't really get into the details in the urban area at the scales that we have to work with. And so he's interested in having a program that did that. And so I think that would probably be a really important thing to do is to have expert study of that system. there's no question that climate change is going to increase groundwater flooding. I mean, that's without doubt. So, it seems like that's a pretty good incentive to do this. So does that help? I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
Where would you anticipate that the groundwater table would be increasing the most?
well, that's a good thing, a good issue, a good question. We don't know enough about the soils, and as I mentioned, the soils are different in urbanized areas than they were. They're less predictable than they are in the ag area, where they haven't changed nearly as much. Obviously, topography. And topography, so lands that are relatively low compared to the surrounding lands are going to be vulnerable. So it ought to be possible. I know the survey's already identified some locations. I'm thinking south of the Arboretum, for example, there's a development there that never should have been developed, where they've had high water tables for a long time. And of course, the solution they would like to see is to drain all that out into the lakes. Okay, so that's the challenge. But I think there are ways. People who are you get together with people who understand this kind of system. You get a set of experts could probably do a pretty good job of anticipating where those are. I know the east side is very vulnerable. There are homes that were protected for many years because Oscar Mayer was pumping so much groundwater that they lowered the levels. When Oscar Mayer stopped, then they got flooded. So we already have a pretty good idea where there is currently problems, and we can probably extrapolate from that to find other ones.
Great. Just any further follow-up? No, that's a great question and great example of how complicated the systems are. We have one more question from Meg Gordon. We're not hearing the question yet.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Carol. Ken, my question for you, it seems from your talk that we are really not very prepared, and the solutions do exist, and the science is there, the expertise for predictions of what it's going to look like in the future with climate change. But what, in your experience, is the best response to people who will say, we get it, but now isn't the best time to spend the money?
Yeah, well, that I think all you have to do is to highlight those places that are already getting flooded, and maybe we haven't done a good enough job of documenting that. So I don't think enough people are aware of the widespread damage that occurred 2 years ago. Well, Middleton is, for example, because they had a couple feet of water in a number of commercial places. So I think it's one could put together a pretty good cost-benefit analysis on this and demonstrate that if we, what it would be, what the cost would be if we don't do something. Maybe that would be the best way to do this, is to use examples from what we have and to kind of project in the future. That's I think the best. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. We really need to do this. It's because again, either the climate change thing by itself or the development thing by itself, either one of those are huge problems. The combination is so clearly overwhelming that I think the cost benefit would be pretty effective.
All right, thank you, Meg. Thanks, Ken. Thank all of you on the Climate Crisis Forum Committee for your questions, and extra thanks to Professor Potter for giving us the benefit of his expertise and some great pictures, great examples, and things ideas to chew on as we go forward. I just want to remind everyone although these topics are relevant all the time, that right now as we're recording, we're looking forward to a vote in Madison City Council on stormwater ordinance that relates to this quite closely. So thanks everyone who's concerned about this issue. Yes, Ken.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody who's seeing this presentation, feel free to email me, and I'll go out and look at your house. But I think we've got to get the word out, and so I'm available. I have time to do this, and I really enjoy it. So feel free to give me an email.
All right, you heard it there. You can get the professor to come out and help you out. So that's great. Thank you, Ken. Thanks, everybody. And we're looking forward to when we can have more forums in person. So thanks very much for participating in the Nano Forum.